code 5715, answering the question, how will tariff policy affect consumer spending this summer?
When our President Trump slapped tariffs on almost every country across the world, he made one special exemption, Korean cars, because he thought they were cute.
Yeah, I don't know what I would do if Trump called me cute.
Unfortunately, for most Americans, Trump's economic policy isn't exactly their type. Who better to explain this to us than The Economist just 2 hours ago, when they go on to find that the life and blood of our economy, us, namely in the way we spend, as quantified by consumer spending, constitute 2/3 of all of America's GDP. But that life and blood seems to be running short. As they also go on to lament, consumer spending now only increased by 0.9% in the last year, marking a 3-year consecutive decline in the metric. But it doesn't just reflect our aggregate ability to purchase. It reflects the unique aspects of every sector, finding that although Trump slapped tariffs of 10% across the entire world, specific items, everything from Chinese electric vehicles to Canadian manufacturing, faced excess tariffs, those leaving us with the most impacted. But we pay the price of tariffs in more ways than we can imagine. As the Yale Budget Laboratory from earlier this year goes on to find in their quantitative modeling, the average American household pays an additional $2,000 every single month as a result of Trump's tariff policy. It's because we quite literally pay the price of poor economic policy that we must ask the question, how will Trump's tariff policy affect consumer spending this upcoming summer? To which the answer is incredibly clear. It'll only continue to dwindle it. But in the sectors who are already most vulnerable, more specifically, first, in housing, second, technology, and finally, essential medical care. But when Jamal Bowen, a New York representative, ran on housing affordability, he was surprised that he lost by 30 percentage points. But his first response, a LinkedIn announcement. I'm excited to announce that even though we may have lost today, I shaped my state's politics forever. Yeah, there's no end to the political LARP. But the impact Americans feel in their housing is more than real. It's also the first way in which we see the detrimental impacts of tariff policy in consumer spending, and that's specifically amongst the affordability of our housing. As the National Association for Realtors and Homeowners finds in their January analysis of this year, that supply and demand works especially true when it comes to our housing sector. But because our houses are constructed of essential supplies from foreign countries, think everything from minerals to metals, it's no surprise they estimate Trump's tariffs will result in the construction of 450,000 fewer homes. And that's a recipe Americans know already all too well. When CNN polling from just 5 hours ago goes on to contend that amongst our youngest generation of those under 30, 90% say they want to buy a home, but actively can't afford it. And the supply of housing continues to be squeezed, and homes become just that much more expensive. It's no surprise Americans have to opt out in all entirety. And when the National Association for the Homeless finds in December 16th at the end of last year, we all have the luxury of being part of the 340 million Americans who call this nation home. But for 750,000, they can't even afford to own one. Those are the numbers we only see continue to grow. But the landmark representation of US technology and technology at large has been AI. So I actually asked my bud ChatGPT for some advice. What he told me? The way code 5715 will dominate the final round of USX STEMP. Focusing on being serious, giving good content, and giving a great speech. Yeah, for all my debate coaches out there, I think your job is safe. But for most Americans, they'll probably need multiple jobs to pay for US technology. The second way, we see the impacts of consumer spending as reflected by tariff policy, as technology continues to shift more and more out of reach. Because, as an article by the Brookings Institution from just 4 days ago goes on to elaborate, it's no surprise that Trump has actually put excess tariffs on technology. For instance, 100% tariffs on Chinese semiconductors, which in total has driven away $3 trillion into AI and other technology investment, as they found, have pushed things like green energy up by around 22%. At a time where the Pew Research Center goes on to find in their April polling that 1 in every 3 Americans say they already actively struggle with their energy bills. Things like energy and the rest of technology at large don't just reflect how America chooses and responds to its growth heading forward, but how they're able to live and survive to get there. But one of the biggest concerns of our medical sector, as reported by hospitals, was actually YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels, where they find that now the average attention span is just under 10 minutes. Good news, your boy's first speaker. But the final way, and we can see the specific impacts in consumer spending as a result of tariff policy, is in our medical sector, but the most essential medical care, because the majority of it, while provided in America, is outsourced by foreign countries. That's explained by our National Institute of Health at the end of 2023, where they go on to write that specific essential care services are something America outsources from the rest of the world, finding that as a result of tariff policy, the need for specific and essential services is expected to drop by a whopping 20%. Because even though the United States has the most basic medical technology available, our power is in the fact we're able to buy very specific care from foreign countries. But that only leaves Americans as the most impacted. Because, as an article by the American Institute of Medical Health goes on to quantify just 19 hours ago, 22,000 Americans lost their lives because their medical care wasn't affordable or accessible. It's not just about their spending and the ability to afford this care. Because if they can't pay with their wallets, they end up paying with their lives. But for those 22,000 Americans, while their story was cut short, their legacy still lives through the question: how will tariff policy affect consumer spending this upcoming summer? The answer? Duh. It's going to be decreasing it in the most critical areas, but more specifically, doing so first in housing, second, technology, and finally, essential medical care. And so even though Trump's type may be foreign internationals, and I may not be fitting that, it's clear the consequences in consumer spending and our ability to make everyday purchases aren't felt abroad, but right here at home.
Congratulations on making the final round of Extemp.
Thank you so much.
I just have a couple of questions.
Sure.
In your third point, you mentioned that the United States imports essential medical services. What exactly are these services?
Yeah, for example, in something like specific kinds of cancer research, for instance, in certain things like radiation, right? We get a lot of rare earth minerals needed from the services, for instance, from countries like China, who produces around 90% of the world's rare earth minerals.
Thank you. So it's research materials that are being impacted by tariffs, not materials that are actually being used on real American patients, correct?
A mineral is a real material.
Yes, but you say it's being used for cancer research. How is this impacting the lives of real American cancer
Wait,
patients?
that's like specifically after cancer research is done, it's done like these minerals are used to construct important technologies that are needed to deliver the treatment. I'd argue it's not as simple as it being research or specific services, it's a combination of the two.
Thank you. And how much are these tariffs then driving up the prices of that treatment for real American patients?
Well, I can't tell you for the specific treatment. What I tell you on aggregate is it's around 20%. I say this because different services face different impacts. But I'd argue if the majority of services are becoming less affordable, Americans are obviously going to spend less on them.
Thank you. Let's discuss your second point of energy. You mentioned that our green energy resources are being impacted by tariffs. Specifically, what is being imported from other countries to process green energy that we're seeing a tariff increase on?
Yeah, for the sake of simplicity, we can actually turn back to that very same example. Rare earth minerals are essential in the construction of green technology. We get those specifically from countries like China, where we actually chose to impose even higher tariffs than base tariffs. That makes it more expensive for them, and they push the cost on us.
Thank you. How many rare earth minerals does the United States import every single year, and at what rate are those being tariffed by the Trump administration?
Well, that's two questions. I'll go in backwards order. First, we import like the majority of our foreign energy, and specifically if we look at something like rare earth minerals, right? We're around 60 dependent on foreign countries, and yes, we are tariffing them. In fact, if we look towards Chinese rare earth minerals, they actually face a 125% tariff. They aren't being tariffed less, they're being tariffed more.
Congratulations again.
Thank you.
That was Speaker 1 being cross-examined by Speaker 6, code 5550. Speaking second is code 5718, answering the question, is the United States prepared for another severe hurricane season?
Recently, inventors have just discovered a new way to decrease carbon emissions. Meet the Carpuccino, a car that runs completely on coffee. Gaining inspiration from Back to the Future's trash-powered DeLorean, this miracle invention can go 1 mile on 56 shots of espresso. I guess America really does run on Dunkin'. But in all seriousness, the Carpuccino is a coffee-brained approach that only shows us how dire our political scientists as well as legal scholars are coming when it comes to responding to today's environmental crises. Indeed, the National Weather Service contextualizes just a few months ago that within the past couple of decades, the United States has experienced unprecedented hurricanes. Take, for example, Hurricane Francine in 2024, or Hurricane Ida in 2021, which both in the states of Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi caused over 500,000 individuals to lose access to basic electricity. But that's why we're seeing more legislation in purgatory right now. In fact, ABC News corroborates that right now the Hurricane Hunter Recapitalization Act is in purgatory in the United States Senate, which would essentially ameliorate the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's approach to hurricane funding and hurricane aid. But it's when considering that this is more than just an issue of national preparedness. It's considering that since 2016, over 4,000 individuals have lost their lives because of a major hurricane. The United States cannot afford to wait any longer. Therefore, we ask today's question, is the United States prepared for another severe hurricane season? The answer is an unfortunate no, because of a lack of because of structural barriers in both the aftermath and preparation for a hurricane, whether it be through, first, barriers to getting aid from FEMA, second, case backlogs, and finally, but perhaps most importantly, an over-reliance on reactive funding. Now, President Trump recently turned 80 years old, which means that he's actually the first president to have his age be higher than his IQ. But if anything, it's his short-sighted mindset that's unfortunately going to prove disastrous when it comes to our environmental preparation. And so the first reason as to which the United States is unfortunately not prepared for a major hurricane season is because of technical barriers that make it hard to get aid to FEMA. An article from Brookings, an American think tank, explains in December of 2024 that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, is essentially responsible for diagnosing federal aid after a major hurricane or natural disaster. And even though they recently got an increase in funding by around $1 billion, they're not actually prepared to guarantee aid for millions of Americans. That's because the Center for American Progress argues just a few months ago that there is a lot of red tape or bureaucratic limbo that actually makes it hard for Americans to get help after a hurricane. Take, for example, where they actually have to provide multiple documents that prove they legally own their home. This isn't just difficult for millions of Americans, but it disproportionately impacts minority families in the United States. That's because the Joint Center for Housing Studies quantifies that while white families are around 75% more likely to have documentation that they own their home, minority families are only 40% likely to have documentation that they do. That means that this isn't just a matter of hurricane season preparation, it's become an issue about racial systemic inequities. The Public Broadcasting Service concludes that it's because of this legal loophole that around 46% of families of color didn't get the basic aid they needed after a hurricane within the past 10 years. Meaning, issues like these are only going to perpetuate the mass racism as well as lack of preparedness we see. But secondly, it seems like despite the fact that around 70% of the globe's internet traffic flows through Northern Virginia, it's pretty ironic considering the amount of tech issues the extempors have had this tournament. But even then, I would go to say that our internet is more reliable than the nation's emergency preparedness situation. And so the second reason as to which the United States is unfortunately not prepared for a major hurricane season is because of case backlogs. The New York Times tells us in January of this year that at the beginning of his administration, President Trump cut FEMA by around 20%. And unfortunately, the Government Accountability Office corroborates that this means thousands of employees across the country are now being forced to take on jobs that they not only don't know how to do, but also are completely unprepared to do. And that's leading to what we call case backlog. In fact, the American Bar Association further explains that when it comes to emergency preparedness, large federal agencies, like namely FEMA, have a backlog of around 500,000 cases, meaning that there's thousands of families in the United States that are not just waiting to get basic help after a natural disaster, but they're first of all waiting to get approved to get basic help. For millions of families, that wait could easily end in death. It's our government's ability to prepare us and keep us safe. But when they fail to do just that, it's clear they're doing the opposite. But the final reason as to which the United States is unfortunately not prepared for a major hurricane season is because we have historically relied on reactive funding. An article from the Public Broadcasting Service elucidates in January of this year that reactive funding is essentially where the United States aims to ameliorate the crisis, namely for natural disasters after it happens, rather than trying to prevent it. In fact, they tell us in a separate article, this time published just a few weeks ago, that historical precedent like the Stafford Act of 1988 designated the United States and encouraged them to increase the amount of federal funding after a major hurricane. But instead, what we need right now is more one-on-one individualized help. Luckily, Brookings explains in a separate article, this time in September of last year, that the United States needs to pass the FEMA Resurgency Act of 2025, a bill that's currently in purgatory. By doing so, we would be able to increase public assistance programs and make FEMA assistance a more localized issue. In this sense, thousands of families won't have to wait on the federal government's delays just to get basic aid they need. It'll come quicker, therefore, more families and lives won't be lost. In my home state of California, we recently had the Palisades fires where homes were burned down, small businesses closed, and families lost loved ones. The United States can't afford to have another major natural disaster. And it's for that reason that we return to today's question. Is the United States prepared for another severe hurricane season? The answer was unfortunately no, because of structural barriers in preparation and the aftermath, whether it be through first, a legal loophole through FEMA aid, second, case backlogs, and finally, an over-reliance on reactive funding. The United States needs to learn that the cappuccino is a coffee brain solution to a problem we already know how to solve. Plus, the energy in the prep room shows us it's not the best idea to power things on caffeine. In any sense, it's time for the United States to ameliorate this crisis, so every American can have a tasty cup of joe.
Speaker 2 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 1, code 5715.
Great speech, but as per usual, just a few questions.
Of course.
Let's go straight into it. On your first point at the end, you tell us the majority of families aren't getting an aid after a hurricane. In your last point, you tell us that almost all aid is reactive, meaning they would get it after the hurricane. Which is it?
Sure, so as we can see throughout my points, it's actually a mixture of both. While I do agree that the points can seem contradictory, it's actually that the United States federal government needs to prioritize improving aid to prevent these natural disasters, but they also need to prioritize aid that helps families in the event of a natural disaster, specifically afterwards.
Okay, more specifically, is US hurricane funding reactive or proactive?
A majority of it tends to be reactive.
Okay, if the majority of it is reactive, then how are you going to have that contradiction between your first and third point? Because you're telling us the funding isn't being delivered.
Sure, so when we go back to the question, it's asking if the United States is currently prepared. It's not asking what needs to be done to improve the overall funding allocation system for our emergency preparedness. But when we're looking at the question, which is asking if the United States is currently prepared, we have to look towards the fact that we do heavily rely on reactive funding. That's why we need to prioritize ameliorating that type of process.
So let's go specifically into your third point. You tell us the biggest problem is that the government is distributing funding and it's not localized. I want to clarify how FEMA works. Does FEMA just send money to all of these different places, or are there local agencies which distribute FEMA funding?
So essentially, individuals can apply for aid for FEMA after a natural disaster, but what I was advocating for is to localize the process even more. That way wait times can decrease and more individuals get the aid they need.
So you're agreeing it's already local, that's an established fact, you're just saying make it more local.
I'm not saying that FEMA is currently local because as it says in the name, FEMA is a federal agency. What I am saying is that trying to localize it and taking steps to make that care more accessible will decrease the overall wait times.
That seems to be time.
Thank you.
Speaking third is code 5714, answering the question, which foreign policy challenge is most likely to shape the 2026 midterm election?
If there's one thing that Democrats and Republicans both hate, it's being bipartisan. For the Democrats, it's because they don't like working with the Republicans whatsoever. And for the Republicans, they probably saw the word bi in bipartisanship and said absolutely not. Unfortunately for the Republicans, though, their extremely partisan foreign policy might now harm them in the 2026 midterm elections. As explained by the Foreign Affairs magazine just 2 days ago, right now the Trump administration's foreign policy is extremely inconsistent, as they promised to start no new wars, along with ending conflicts like the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Gaza conflict. Right now, though, they failed on all three of those promises. But one major one is the idea of starting no new wars. Because back in February, Trump started a new war against Iran that has lasted up until this week. And now, many Americans are starting to feel the brunt of the cost, whether it's economic or the loss of their voice in our nation. Because of this, as the 2026 midterms are approaching, Americans are now wondering which foreign policy challenge is going to shape this 2026 midterm election, or in other words, which one will have the most influence on American voters. Because it's when considering that Trump's war on Iran has represented a decline in our democracy, one in which Congress is being overreached, and millions of Americans who didn't ask for this war are now paying the cost. We have an opportunity in the 2026 midterms to deliver a rebuke to our government that has shown no care for us whatsoever. And it's for that reason that we must answer today's question. Which foreign policy challenge is most likely to shape the 2026 midterm elections? The answer is the Iran war, because the issues with the Iran war appeal to what voters are most concerned about, which we can see in three ways. First, the economy. Second, our democracy. And third, and finally, our desire to end new wars. During his 2024 presidential campaign, Donald Trump promised to the American people that he would make America more affordable again and reduce costs across the country. But to Donald Trump, campaign promises are a lot like the Epstein files. They just happen to magically disappear. Unfortunately, the issue of affordability isn't disappearing for everyday Americans. The first reason as to why the Iran war will be the foreign policy challenge that shapes the 2026 midterm elections is because it's harming our economy. As explained by NPR just 3 days ago, the economy is one of the biggest voting issues in the 2026 midterms, with 42% of American voters listing it as their #1 concern. In fact, we've seen this historically in American elections as well, because the Republicans won in 2024 because Americans were concerned about inflation under the Biden administration. After all, right now, more than half of American citizens are living paycheck to paycheck, and all they're seeking is economic relief. Unfortunately, in the 2026 midterms, we're going to see that the Iran war has the biggest role to play, and that's because it's significantly harmed our economy. That's explained by Columbia University just yesterday, where they explained that due to the Iran war, the Strait of Hormuz was closed, which is a key trade route that allows for oil and gas, along with other goods, to flow all across the world. Because of this Iran war, gas prices in the United States have risen by over 40%, with the dollar at the pump sitting well above $4. And additionally, oil prices have skyrocketed by as much as 60% in the last few months, clearly showing that our economy is in grave danger. Because of this, the Iran war is going to have the greatest impact on the 2026 midterms, because now it's challenging the livelihoods of everyday Americans, as they have to increase their expenses in order to deal with President Trump's foreign policy. Clearly, the incompetence of our government is costing millions of Americans. It's time that in the 2026 midterms, we deliver a rebuke, not just to remove the Republicans from power, but also to gain our economic livelihoods back. The second reason, though, as to why the Iran war is going to have a significant effect when it comes to the 2026 midterm elections is because now it's threatening our democracy, something that Americans are extremely concerned about. That's explained by Ipsos in a poll just 3 days ago, where they explained that another major voter concern for Americans is the state of our democracy. Nearly 84% of Americans believe that our democracy is in grave danger because the executive continues to get more and more power. And as a result, Americans are feeling that their voice is being lost in our democracy. Unfortunately, that's exactly what's happening when it comes to the Iran war, because Trump has taken extremely undemocratic actions in order to start this war in the first place, meaning Americans aren't going to approve of this. As explained by the New York Times on March 12th of 2025, when President Trump launched this war, he didn't ask Congress for permission whatsoever, instead going onto this war and not following the War Powers Resolution. Congress, under the Constitution, has the only authority to start these wars. And now, because of this, we're seeing a major concern in our United States because democracy isn't being followed by the executive branch. Thus, we're going to see that this has a major impact in the 2026 midterms because Americans are noticing our democracy is in grave danger. After all, when the will of one man in power supersedes the desires of 300 million Americans, that's no democracy, that's an autocracy. The third and final reason, though, as to why the Iran war is going to be the most significant conflict that impacts the 2026 midterms is because right now, Americans don't want any new wars. That's explained by the Washington Post on March 15th of 2026, where they explain that another voter concern of Americans is their desire to end all wars that America is involved with. After all, that's what Donald Trump promised in the 2024 election and why he won in the first place. But there's two reasons as to why that's the case. First, Americans don't want this money going towards these wars and instead want it to promote domestic spending and improve our economy. But additionally, they don't want our soldiers to risk their lives in conflicts that are unnecessary. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Iran war, Trump has violated both of these concerns, and as a result, it's going to impact the 2026 midterms. That's because the Council on Foreign Relations explains on March 19th of 2026 that right now, Trump's start of this war has become extremely disapproved by everyday Americans, with over 61% of Americans saying they disapprove of the war altogether. The reason why, though, is because right now, Trump is risking American livelihoods and is now starting a new war that he promised literally not to do. And because of this, Americans feel that their voice isn't being heard at the ballot box. Clearly, Trump has violated the will of the American people and has violated our sovereignty as well, showing that now it's going to become a major concern in the 2026 midterms when they vote against a party that has failed to deliver on any promise. After all, when it comes to the Iran war, we have lost nearly 13 service members due to this unnecessary conflict. It's for those brothers and sisters who don red, white, and blue and represent our nation that we must vote in their regard and ensure that the Republican administration is gone and this war ends in Iran as we know it. So when returning to today's question, which foreign policy challenge will shape the 2026 midterm elections? The answer is going to be the Iran war, and that's because it appeals to key voter concerns in the United States. First, being our economy. Second, our democracy. And third and finally, our desire to end all wars. Our democracy is in its 250th year, but now it's facing the greatest challenges we've seen ever. Fortunately, all of us Americans, whether you're eligible to vote or can get somebody else to vote, could now bring somebody to the polls and voice the greatest power we have in our democracy, the ability to go to the ballot box and offer a referendum to our government. It's important we all go out and vote and rebuke this administration, because as long as they continue with our actions, it means that if we don't speak now, our voices will be silenced forever. Thank you.
Speaker 3 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 2, code 5718.
Congrats on a great speech.
Thank you.
As always, I just have a few questions. So starting off on your first point, when you talk about the economy, considering the fact that historically the economy has been the least polarizing issue, how exactly are first parties going to see their voter support change in the 2026 midterms, but also how are they going to adapt as a result?
I don't necessarily think that's relevant to the question. Right now, the question is asking what's going to shape the election, and ultimately, the election is decided by voter desires. What we're seeing is the #1 voter desire happens to be the economy, and right now, the Iran war is starting to harm the economy. Because of this, you're going to see many Republicans shift to the Democratic Party because they're seeing that the Democrats are on an anti-Iran war campaign and are now looking to reduce gas prices and things that are affecting everyday Americans. Americans feel these things in their pockets, and now they're going to continue to suffer if the Republican administration stays in power.
So while I agree that the economy is a big issue, you're saying that thousands of voters across the country are going to be willing to completely change their party side and preferences just because of this one issue?
Yes.
All right, so moving on to your next point where you tell us about democracy. Considering the fact that in the coming weeks, the Supreme Court is set to decide on things like birthright citizenship, aren't these greater challenges to our democracy than a foreign policy issue?
Once again, that could be true, but that doesn't change the fact that the Iran war is a major concern when it comes to our democracy. Ultimately, Trump is superseding the power of Congress and their ability to start a war. And now if Trump continues to do that, that represents a threat to the American democracy that they're extremely concerned about. The Supreme Court can be true, but this argument can be true in the same world as well.
All right, so now moving on to your last point where you talk about politicians' promises. As we all know, historically, politicians don't tend to fulfill their promises. So what makes President Trump's reversal on his promises different this time?
Because right now, Americans are seeing the effects of it. We have lost American soldiers in this battle. We have lost unnecessary lives, and now livelihoods all across the United States are being impacted. Americans feel this war, whether they like it or not, and now they're going to rebuke this administration because they know if they don't remove this administration, these impacts will be felt for another 2 years. Ultimately, it's the American will to decide what we want. And now, since Americans are concerned that our democracy is at risk and that they're not being heard, they're not going to accept an empty promise from a politician. They're going to take action because our voices are strong enough in order to impact our government.
All right, congratulations again.
Speaking forth is code 5706. Answering the question, what economic messages are most resonating with voters in the United States?
My brother Shane is 2.5 years younger than me and is without a doubt my best friend. We do everything together, binge watch Star Wars, talk about philosophy, and have played sports together since we were young. But the one thing that we don't do together is laugh at my jokes, because normally I'm doing that, but he's not. Normally my brother's reactions to one of my jokes is less like this and more like this. And according to reporting from just seconds ago, that is the face he's making right now as he watches through the live stream. Now, while my brother often has an unamused face when he hears one of my jokes, many Americans across our country are likely making a similar face to my brother regarding the state of the United States economy. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics informs us that inflation has been steadily rising across the past several months. And we've seen that the most recent indicator from May of this year saw inflation at 4.3%, over double of the desired 2% rate. And with Donald Trump also making strange statements such as saying that the affordability crisis is a hoax, many Americans are increasingly discontent with the economic situation in our country. And so as we approach the midterms in November of this year, we ask today's question: what economic messages are most resonating with voters in the United States? And the answer to this is messages related to affordability. And we see this for three key reasons. First, Donald Trump was elected to solve this issue, and yet the problem is still persisting. Second, the issue of affordability has been steadily rising in our country and is reaching new heights right now. And third and finally, voters themselves are showing that this economic message resonates with them. So first, my brother is generally considered by our friends, as well as our mom, to be more nonchalant than me. And so whenever he doesn't laugh at one of my jokes, I just blame it on the fact that he's trying to be too nonchalant. Now, while I can blame my brother's nonchalantness on not laughing at my jokes, Donald Trump is running out of the ability to blame economic issues related to affordability on Joe Biden. He's coming up on 2 years into his second term. And in light of the fact that voters elected him to solve issues related to affordability, and yet the problem is still going on, the first reason why economic messages related to affordability are resonating is that voters elected him to do this, and yet it's still continuing. In polling conducted by Gallup on October 9th of 2024, they asked voters what the key issue was for them heading into the 2024 election. And the only issue that a majority of voters said was the most important issue to them in 2024 was economic issues. And additionally, when they lowered the bar a little bit and asked voters what played a significant role but not the most important, they found that 9 in 10 voters said economic issues played a role in deciding their vote in the 2024 election. But the reality is that voters are seeing that Donald Trump has not done much to solve issues related to affordability after skyrocketing inflation under Joe Biden. And we see this in an article published by NPR just yesterday. And it informs us that 60% of Americans disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy. And then also that U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics report once again reports rocketing inflation that we've seen as a result of the Iran war. The first reason why economic messages related to affordability are resonating with voters is that voters elected both Donald Trump as well as Republicans to the House and Senate in 2024 to solve issues related to the cost of living. And since this problem has been persisting with no change in sight, messages related to this issue are resonating with voters. Now, second, another one of my brother's most common responses to one of my bad jokes is, "That was one of the worst jokes I've ever heard in my life." And apparently I'm getting better at doing this because that's one of his most commonly used lines. Now, while I'm getting better at making bad jokes for my brother, the problem of affordability in our country has been steadily rising and is reaching new heights right now. And this is the second reason why messages related to it are resonating with American voters. Returning to different polling done by Gallup, this time published on April 28 of 2026, they found that consistently rated as the worst economic issue in our country right now amongst voters was inflation and high prices. And then they also have a different statistic that they analyzed where they asked voters whether or not their finances are getting worse. And they found in this polling that 55% of Americans right now say that their finances are getting worse. And that's the highest they've recorded with that statistic since they started recording it in 2001. But it's also not just what voters are saying, but economic analysis shows that this is an issue as well. In a study from the Brookings Institute, published on May 27th of 2026, they studied what percentage of American households were able to afford basic necessities. And they put this under the umbrella term of make ends meet. And this study found that in nearly every year since 2014, over 40% of American households have not been able to make ends meet financially. The second reason why economic messages related to affordability are resonating with voters in the United States right now is that this problem has been persistent in our country, but also has been growing as of late. And this political moment is causing Americans to respond. And then finally, what my brother doesn't know, and that I'm revealing to him right now in this speech, is that him not laughing at my jokes only causes me to plan and prepare more jokes like that just to see how he responds. Now, while I just revealed that to my brother through this speech, the American people are also revealing that affordability is the issue that's most resonating with them. And we see this through both polling and election results. This is the third reason why this issue is the most resonating one for Americans. So if we look at Ipsos polling published on May 8th of this year, they asked Americans what their top issue was when it comes to their vote heading into the 2026 midterms. And 45% of voters said that the cost of living in our country was what was going to be deciding their vote in November. And then additionally, we can look at the next closest issue, which was democratic values, was significantly lower with 23%. So clearly, cost of living is something that is very powerfully resonating with American voters right now. But it's also not just polling related to the midterms. We can look at election results. An article published by Politico on April 18th of 2026 analyzed over 200 state and federal elections that have occurred since 2024. And they found that in the vast majority of these elections, Democrats have been able to make significant gains, whether that be flipping seats or causing Republicans in red areas to get significantly less votes. And one Democratic analysis within this article described the fact that the reason that this was happening was because of the Democrats' marketing and campaigning related to affordability for Americans. So the third and final reason why economic messages related to affordability are most resonating with voters in the United States right now is that we can just go to the voters themselves and see that their polling, as well as results that we're seeing in elections, reveal that this is a top issue to them. So while my brother is often unamused with pretty much all of my jokes, Americans across our country are increasingly unamused with the economic state of our country, namely the cost of living and affordability. So we return to today's question. What economic messages are most resonating with voters in the United States? And we saw the answer was messages related to affordability for those three key reasons. First, Donald Trump was elected to solve this issue. And since he hasn't, these midterms are going to be a referendum on the fact that he hasn't. Second, this problem has been persistently growing in our country and is now reaching new heights. And finally, voters are revealing that right now in this political moment, both through polling and election results, that affordability messages are resonating. And so we have yet to see how the 2026 midterms are going to play out. When it comes to economic messaging in our country, it's very clear that this political moment in 2026 will go down as the year of affordability. Thank you.
Speaker 4 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 3, code 5714.
Congratulations on a great speech.
Thanks,
I just have a few questions.
Yep.
So just as an overarching question for your entire speech, you talk about affordability messaging. What does that look like?
Yeah, so what that looks like is messaging related to lowering the cost of goods and daily life in the United States. So for example, we can look to the New York City mayor's race with Zoran Mandani. And he consistently built his platform on the fact that he was seeking to lower costs for the people in New York to pay for things such as groceries as well as housing. And so affordability messaging is primarily related to messaging built on the daily economic interactions that American families have and seeking to lower the costs that they pay on a daily basis.
And is there a specific type of economic messaging regarding affordability? For example, is housing being more resonant than food, or is gas being more resonant? Which one is right now most resonant with the American people?
Well, obviously, I would probably say gas messaging would probably be most related because of the rising gas costs as a result of the Iran war. But overall, this is just a general term that resonates with the fact that many Americans are paying for a variety of goods across their daily lives. And so while there are some specific issues like gas prices that would likely resonate with them right now, affordability is really an across-the-board issue that captures a lot of different aspects.
Awesome. Let's jump to your first point where you say the Trump administration has been failing on this issue. Have Democrats offered an alternative, or is nobody offering affordability messaging right now?
Well, ultimately, Democrats have been responding with just a focus on affordability. So like I said, Donald Trump, to defend his economic messaging, has come out in some instances and said that the affordability crisis is a hoax invented by Democrats. But we see that when we ask Americans what is resonating with them right now, they feel that the cost of living in our country is way too high. And so because Donald Trump has been failing on this, Democrats have just in general been promoting an affordability message. But that's why we've seen a lot of instances such as Democratic socialists winning in areas such as cities and mayoral races, where they're describing lowering costs through government intervention, such as paying for busing or housing.
Awesome. Let's jump to your first point where you talk about how affordability is becoming worse. Is it true that in the last 10 years, affordability has been consistently getting worse through each of those 10 years?
Yes, that is true. So like I said, the Gallup polling found that 55% of Americans said that their finances are getting worse. That's the most, not just in the past 5 or 10 years, that's the most that they've recorded for that statistic since 2001. And then like I said, that Brookings Institute analysis conducted showed that in roughly the past 10 years, over 40% of American families couldn't make ends meet.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Speaking fifth is code 5757, answering the question, how should policymakers prepare the power grid for rising electricity demand?
All the best slumber parties starts with the lights off. That's what Ashley Jackson has to tell her 4-year-old to explain why the lights are turning off at 6 p.m. She tells the Houston Chronicle on August 9th, it's been a rough few months. And so as a result, when her electricity prices increased, she couldn't pay them. And yet, The Economist points out on January 27th, this comes at a time when the United States is hungrier than ever for new electricity, in part because of AI data centers, and in part because of more people. Our demand is going to triple by 2031. But as a result, prices are also likely to increase by 27%. And now politicians have promised that they're ready to make our power grid able to transport this electricity from one place to another. But failure after failure causes us to doubt them. It's when considering, though, in his book Superpower, that Harvard professor Brett Goldberg explains to us that if the United States is able to rebuild our power grid effectively, more than 16 million Americans will be able to turn the lights on. That it's for their sake that we ask today's question. How should policymakers prepare the power grid for rising electricity demand? The answer is that they can take action to solve the problems facing it today. They can, first, refurbish the old grid, and then, secondly, connect it to newer power sources, and finally, expand the grid to new locations. Right now, Ashley is pretty confused. She assumes that the United States is able to have a new shiny power grid. She constantly sees construction outside of her house. But that's actually the first way in which policymakers can help prepare the power grid for rising electricity demand. They can help refurbish the grid. The problem is that the United States power grid is really, really old. In fact, the Princeton One Energy Project explained in a briefing they published on October 27th, the majority of our power grids were built in 1947 during a sweeping goal to try and modernize the United States. But this means close to 80 years later, the copper wires that connect the power grid and the cement that centers it have now crumbled. This means that as we need more electricity than ever, our grids can't carry it. Take the example of the early winter storms within Texas. More than 14 different power grids shut down because their copper wires snapped. And so the solution is to refurbish this grid. In fact, in the Repower Bill, H.R. 3947 is currently pending in front of Congress. It would fund $3 billion to refurbish cement and buy more than 20,000 new copper wires. This bill was based off of a plan within Michigan, which refurbished its power grids and last summer saw a 27% spike in power necessity. No one saw their power go out because it was refurbished. But Ashley doesn't understand why sometimes the lights will flare up in her house and then go out. But that's the second way in which policymakers can prepare our power grid for rising electricity demand. They can connect it to new power sources. The problem right now is that we're building AI data centers and houses. However, our electricity grid and power grid is incapable of connecting them. The American civil engineers dumbed it down for me and all of us on January 13th. They explained that when a new AI data center needs new power, they request it from the grid. And so the grid sends it all at once, which overwhelms the grid, causes electricity to flare up really quickly, and then immediately stop. These surges have left more than 27,000 Americans without power in the last month alone, according to a follow-up article. But this is where policymakers can take action. The Department of Energy itself proposed on June 2nd that they set aside about $27 billion to build new generation electricity sites, both through solar panels and through nuclear energy, and connect it to the power grid. They explained that as a result, there won't be surges because there will be more electricity sent at a slower pace to these AI data centers. This means that as a result, the grid will be more interconnected and it'll be more ready for the new generation of technology. But finally, Ashley says that she lives really, really, really far away from major parts of society. And so part of the reason why the power grid isn't prepared is because there's not enough of it. The final way in which policymakers can help prepare themselves for more electricity demand is to build more grids. The problem right now is that we're building data centers and communities need power where there just aren't electricity grids. In fact, in her book, Fraying Wires, Stuttgart professor Amy Constant explains to us that there are more than 3,432 American towns that need power grids but haven't seen them built. Considering that 3 new data centers are going to be built just 28 miles away from Richmond, and there aren't any power grids according to the city of Richmond, we're not prepared at all. But that's where we can step in and build more grids. In fact, the Wall Street Journal theorized on February 28th that the government should set aside about $8 billion new dollars to build new transmission wires with aluminum. They explained that this is actually pretty cheap because the United States government has a reserve of aluminum that we started after our trade war with China. As a result, if we're able to start this, as we already have 6 months ago, and built more than 2,000 new transmission grids, then suddenly, when new places need electricity, we'll be right there to connect them. It's one considering that we are in a theater full of lights, but there are still Americans that have to live in their homes in the darkness. That we need to ask today's question: how should policymakers prepare our power grid for rising electricity demand? The answer is clear. They need to take action to help. They can do this by first refurbishing the good grids that we first have, and then secondly, connecting them to new power sources, before finally expanding the grids to new locations. Ashley is ready to raise her kids in a home full of light. It is time that we take action.
Speaker 5 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 4, code 5706.
Great speech, Daphne.
Thank you.
Do have a couple of questions, though. So first, you talked throughout your speech about the fact how the United States needs to both increase their fixing of old power grids as well as expanding it as well. But oftentimes in situations such as this, they would have to shut that power grid down in order to do that kind of construction. So how do you propose that we meet the energy needs of Americans while also conducting mass construction projects like this that would leave their energy needs unmet?
That's an excellent question, and I have 2 answers. One, refurbishing the power grids with cement actually doesn't require them to shut down because we're just reinforcing the bases. But secondly, I would recommend that policymakers take it one grid at a time, right? That means that most communities still have their power grids on, and it's incremental. As a result, this means that thousands of people don't have to see their power go out at once.
I would press back on your point, though, that we wouldn't need to shut that down. If you're doing electrical work, you're not able to improve the wiring within it with the electricity running through that.
Oh,
so
no,
they
I
would
meant-
have to shut it down, yeah.
Sorry, just to clarify, the cement isn't electricity work, the copper wire is, but I said that we should shut down one by one. Furthermore, building new power grids, I don't think is actually a problem. These places don't have electricity right now. All we would be doing is expanding it.
Got it. And then you also address how we need to hook up electric grids to new sources as well. Would you propose that this be done primarily with green energy sources, or in order to increase efficiency, should it be done with aspects such as fossil fuels?
I think that it should be done in the way that's most effective. The Department of Energy explained that I think we've shut down about 28 nuclear reactors right now that are pretty good and still work. We should use those, whatever is fastest and most effective.
And then finally, in the expansion of the energy grid, that also could lead to very quick and massive construction projects that potentially could lead to failures within those energy systems. So how do you propose that the United States both accelerates electric grid construction, but also ensures that it's not done in such a way that could leave them unstable?
I think that the problem right now is that we're playing with fire if we don't do anything, right? We need to start refurbishing these grids, or in 5 years from now, we're gonna see all of it fail. We already saw that in Texas at a time when people needed energy more than ever, right? These grid projects are essential. We need to take action now. And also, they could probably create American jobs. That would be great as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Daphne.
Thank you.
Speaking sixth is code 5550. Answering the question, what impact are immigration enforcement protests having on major cities?
At the beginning of 2026, a 37-year-old veterans assistant nurse by the name of Alex Preddy was brutally murdered on the streets of Minneapolis by ICE enforcement officers. And while this action was heinous, it was only the beginning of President Trump's plans for ICE this year. The rest are explained in an article published by the New York Times on January 31st, where they articulate that Trump wants to increase the presence of boots on the ground ICE operations across all major cities in the United States. Since January of this year, he's increased the number of immigrants in detention by 37%. Yet, Americans aren't taking this sitting down. Analysis reported by the Washington Post on May 4th of this year explained that over 20 million Americans have participated in retaliatory protests entitled No Kings in almost every major city. And it's when we consider that these protests are integral to the livelihood of all 73,000 immigrants currently in ICE detention as I give you this speech, that it becomes imperative we ask today's question. What impact are immigration enforcement protests having on major cities? And the answer is clear. These protests are thrusting major cities to become leaders against ICE. And this is happening in 3 key ways. First, by implementing protections for immigrants. Second, by pushing back against the federal government. Before finally, influencing local elections and leadership. Unfortunately, Richmond, Virginia isn't a city that provides sanctuary and protection for undocumented immigrants. Yet these are still essential when ensuring the safety of all of these individuals. And so, the first way we can see the impact of major protests on major cities is by increasing the number of sanctuary protections, which before the actions of the Trump administration weren't as popular. Research conducted by the Bipartisan Policy Institute on March 7th of this year explains that prior to the first Trump administration, there were only around 70 sanctuary cities in the United States, which provide protections for undocumented immigrants, such as not allowing illegal search and seizure from ICE officers. However, since the rallying of Americans began this year in favor of undocumented immigrants, sanctuary city protections are being influenced. An article published by Brookings on May 5th of this year explains that since the beginning of No Kings protests in 2025, we've seen an additional 100 cities adopt sanctuary city protections, ensuring the safety for these undocumented immigrants. Meaning, these are having a massive impact on the overall success of sanctuary city policy in local elections in the short term, while simultaneously, protests are directly increasing the safety for undocumented immigrants in the future, proving that this is the first way we're seeing impacts on major cities rooted in these protests. March 14th of 2014 marked one of the most disastrous days in American history because Zayn Malik left One Direction. This created a major divide amongst fans of the band. And it's this similar divide in policy and beliefs that's creating local leader pushback against the federal government as a result of these protests, when local leaders used to be compliant in federal policy. In fact, according to an article published by the White House themselves on March 7th of 2021, Presidents Obama, both of the Bushes, and throughout almost all of history, federal governments have established liaisons to directly communicate with mayors of major cities and state governments in order to establish a stable and healthy relationship. Yet in light of these protests, Donald Trump is moving in the opposite direction, forcing these local leaders to become a mechanism for pushback. In fact, an article published by the LA Times on March 4th of this year explains that following Operation Metro Surge and major protests taking place in Los Angeles in the summer of 2025, Donald Trump has decreased protections and aid to both of these major cities and more that have been impacted by ICE raids because their local leaders have been pushing back against his actions. Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis, has spoken out against the Trump administration's actions multiple times and has now become an advocate for immigrant rights. The same can be said for the mayors of Los Angeles, cities in Denver, and Portland, all of which have been impacted by these ICE raids. Meaning, protests are incredibly important when it comes to establishing the role of local leaders. An article published by Brookings, a Washington-based think tank, on March 7th of this year explains, not only are protests forcing local leaders of these cities to become advocates in the short term, it's creating pushback against the federal government in the long term, changing the role of local government leadership and making it clear this is the second impact we're seeing as a result of protests. However, we all have an opportunity to make more of a change than simply protests, because in 2026, in the fall specifically, we're going to see elections. And so, the third and final area where the impacts of protests against immigration and customs enforcement are clear is because of the impact it will have on local elections and leadership. Yet, historically, immigrations and customs enforcement played very little role in determining the outcomes of local elections. An article published by the Pew Research Center on November 25th of last year explains that in 2016, prior to any of Trump's immigration and customs enforcement policy, only 32% of Americans said that they considered immigration when voting in their local and state elections, meaning the actions of ICE and the impact on immigrants didn't enter their minds when they were in the polls. Yet in the face of major protests and the actions of ICE, this is all changing. An article published by Bloomberg Magazine on August 28th of last year explained that in local elections taking place in 2026, 78% of Americans have cited immigration as a top priority issue for their local elections, meaning it's the actions of ICE and the protest against them that will be entering their mind when they're voting in the polls. And the impacts of voting, that voting will have on immigration leadership will be incredibly important when it comes to creating real change from these protests. And so, it's for this reason that we can see the major impacts that our own actions and protests are having, not only on polling, but the actions that these local leaders will take when they're in office in 2027. And so, it's when we consider the inhumane treatment of millions of undocumented immigrants, paired with the actions and reactions of real American citizens, that it becomes imperative we ask today's question. What impact are immigration enforcement protests having on major cities? The answer is clear. They're thrusting these cities into the spotlight for change, and this is happening in three key ways. First, by increasing the number of sanctuary city protections. Second, by putting local leaders in opposition against the federal government. Before finally, ensuring that there will be an impact from immigration protests in local elections. And so, it's for the sake of Alex Preddy, millions of undocumented immigrants, not only now, for years to come, and because we can have an impact, that we must keep protesting. Thank you.
Speaker 6 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 5, code 5757.
Sylvia, congratulations on a truly excellent speech. I just have a few questions. I want to start off with your first point. Isn't it true that there are some cities that do support ICE, and so as a result, sanctuary status isn't being applied to them because their leaders don't want to?
That's actually exactly what I explained in my on top, Richmond, Virginia, the city we're in right now, may not have sanctuary protections, but we've seen a direct increase of over 100 cities adopting protections in light of these protests and the advocacy of their own citizens, meaning overwhelmingly, local and state governments are being impacted by the actions of their citizens. So while it may not be unanimously effective, it's directly increased real protections for undocumented immigrants.
How is sanctuary status bestowed on a city? What has to happen?
It's not necessarily a specific requirement of you must adopt these exact protections, but instead the existence of policy that protects undocumented immigrants from illegal activities conducted by ICE, meaning it's more safe for undocumented immigrants to be located in that city as opposed to a city with no protection for undocumented immigrants at all.
Okay, so how do we know that it's these protests specifically that are triggering that? In fact, if we look at an example like New York City, they instated sanctuary status before ICE came into the city. How do we know that there's actually a correlation and it's not just leaders taking action?
Because as I explained in my first point, there were already sanctuary cities within the US before ICE. But in light of the actions of ICE and the direct protests that it's had in the past year, we've seen an increase of 100 cities adopting these protections, meaning it's the direct actions of their citizens within 365 days that spurred this policy change.
And finally, moving on to your third point, isn't it true that immigration was one of the largest issues in the 2024 election?
Yes, the 2024 election was presidential. My point specifically refers to the influence of ICE and the actions of illegal enforcement on local policies.
Okay, congratulations again.
You too.
Introducing our winners tonight is our tournament official, Miss Carolyn Cook.
Okay. In sixth place, Nathan Cook from High Valley Christian Academy in Ohio, coached by Nick Newsom and Tom Paisley. In fifth place, Rayhan Bouvaji from Plano West Senior High School in Texas, coached by Megan Clark, Reggie Chapman, and Dave Houston. In fourth place, Sylvia Oglesby from Edina High School in Minnesota, coached by Yatesh Singh, Liz Vera Singh, and Joe Schmidt. In third place, and receiving a $250 scholarship, is Roshan Shivani from Plano West Senior High School in Texas, coached by Megan Clark, Reggie Chapman, and Dave Houston. Placing second in United States extemporaneous speaking, receiving a $500 scholarship, is Natalia San Lucas from Gabrielano High School in California, coached by Derek Yule, Eric Chen, and Ethan Lamb.
And your national champion in Carmendale Fernandez, United States extemporaneous speaking, receiving a trophy and a $1,000 scholarship is Daphne Kalir Starr from College Prep in California. Daphne is coached by Lexi Green, Kay Rollins, and Teddy Gherkin.